it's Miss Seward, and today we are going to be learning about the nitrogen cycle, which hopefully you already did the notes on the carbon cycle, which is 1.4. So this is going to be kind of a similar topic, just talking about nitrogen instead of carbon in that cycle. So some of these terms might be similar. So hopefully you did 1.4 before this one, but today we're going to be talking about nitrogen. Now, the learning objective for this is for you to be able to explain the steps and reservoir interactions in the nitrogen cycle. Some of the essential knowledge that you'll be gaining is the movement of atoms throughout the nitrogen cycle, some of the reservoirs where nitrogen is held, nitrogen fixation, what that process is, and then the idea that the atmosphere is going to be your major reservoir for nitrogen. And the suggested skill that you're going to have at the end of this is to explain relationships between different characteristics of environmental concepts, processes, or models represented visually. So let's start with an overview of the nitrogen cycle, which this diagram is showing you an image of that. Now, the nitrogen cycle is going to be the movement of nitrogen-containing molecules between sources and sinks or reservoirs. Now, sources are going to release nitrogen into the atmosphere, and sinks are going to take nitrogen out of the atmosphere. So again, if you did the 1.4 notes on the carbon cycle, this is going to be similar vocab with sources and sinks. So nitrogen reservoirs are going to hold nitrogen for relatively short periods of time, kind of compared to the carbon cycle. So this is going to be happening. It's going to be faster in the fact that it's not just going to sit for millions of years in one spot. Now, some examples of nitrogen reservoirs are going to be plants, soil, and the atmosphere are kind of your main ones. And the atmosphere is going to be the main nitrogen reservoir. Now, fun fact, it is a very common misconception that oxygen makes up most of our atmosphere because we think we breathe it. But actually, nitrogen makes up majority of our atmospheric gases. In fact, it makes up almost 80% of our atmospheric gases. So most nitrogen is going to be in the atmosphere. It's the main reservoir for nitrogen. And this exists mostly as nitrogen gas, which if you write it out, the chemical symbol is going to be N2. And this form is not usable by plants or animals when it's here in the atmosphere. However, nitrogen is a critical plant and animal nutrient. Nitrogen makes up DNA and amino acids, which make proteins, and all living things need DNA and amino acids. So this sort of leaves us with this question. If we say that nitrogen is necessary, but it's not usable as nitrogen gas, how is it that living things can take in nitrogen if it's stuck in this unusable gas? Well, luckily for you, I'm going to give you the answer to that. And the answer to that question is through this beautiful process called nitrogen fixation. And nitrogen fixation is the process of nitrogen gas being converted into biologically available, which means plants can use it, ammonia or nitrate. And these are going to be the two forms that plants can actually take in, because remember, they can't take in N2 gas. Now we have bacterial fixation. There are certain bacteria that live in the soil, or they have a symbiotic relationship with some plant roots, where they are able to convert atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia. So if you look at this diagram here, you're seeing atmospheric N2 up here. You're seeing this arrow through nitrogen fixing bacteria, which is causing you to get it in the soil here. Now, this bacteria that lives in the root nodules is called rhizobacteria. And some plants that do have this symbiotic relationship in the roots is going to be some legumes, such as peas or beans, and they fix nitrogen for them in return for amino acids from the plant. So remember from our ecosystem notes that the symbiotic relationship there, they're both benefiting. It would be two positives, and that's because the rhizobacteria are going to get the amino acids from the plant, and the plant is going to get the nitrogen from the rhizobacteria. So it's a nice little symbiotic relationship there. Now there's another type of fixation called synthetic fixation. And synthetic kind of means it's not supernatural. That's because humans do it. And this is when humans are going to combust fossil fuels to convert nitrogen gas into nitrate. So it's through a process of fossil fuel combustion, and then through that combustion process, they then harness that nitrogen to get it into nitrate. And the reason that they do this is because nitrates are added to fertilizers like Miracle-Gro, and it's used in agriculture to help make sure that all the plants that are being grown are thriving and getting the nitrogen that they need to do well. So if we look at this diagram here, the red circles are going to represent this combustion is happening here. You follow the arrow down to fertilizer, and this is how you're going to get nitrates into the soil through this fertilizer. Now there's a few other nitrogen cycle steps that are also important. And the first one's going to be assimilation. And this is where plants and animals take nitrogen in and they incorporate it into their body. So plants do this through that nitrate or through ammonium that's in the soil. And then animals assimilate this nitrogen by eating other plants or animals. So ultimately, it got into the plants, which are then eaten by animals, and that's how they get it. So if you notice, blue is this little dot next to assimilation, which is why there's blue circles here showing assimilation. So you can kind of find them in this sort of hectic diagram here. Now, the next one that we have is ammonification. And this is where you have soil bacteria, microbes, and decomposers converting waste and dead biomass back into ammonia and returning it to the soil. So if we look at this process, you have decomposing dead plants and animals, then you've got decomposers like bacteria and fungi who are able to convert that through ammonification, and that again ends up resulting in nitrogen in a usable form in the soil. Then we have nitrification, which is where you're going to take that NH4 and it's going to convert it into nitrate and then nitrite through soil bacteria. And this is going to be happening right here. So you see the NH4, ammonium, where it gets converted into nitrite and nitrate through nitrification. And then we have denitrification, which is the conversion of soil nitrogen in the form of nitrate into nitrous oxide, which is a gas which returns it to the atmosphere. So this is going to be a process that then takes it out of the soil and it ends up going back into the atmosphere. Now, an important aspect of the nitrogen cycle is going to be how humans impact it. So in the climate, so out in the atmosphere, you have nitrous oxide, and this is a greenhouse gas. Greenhouse gases are going to trap the warmth from the sun, which ends up warming Earth's climate. And as we just covered, nitrous oxide can be produced by denitrification of nitrate in agricultural soils. Now, especially this is going to happen when it's overwatered or waterlogged, which there's a lot of watering and fertilizing that's happening through our agricultural processes. And we have this process called ammonia volatilization. And this is where you have excess fertilizer, which can lead to ammonia gas entering the atmosphere. So if you look at this picture here, when you have way extra fertilizer that's not being taken into the soil or by the plants, it can become volatilized where it then ends up going into the atmosphere. And you're going to get ammonia in the atmosphere, and ammonia in the atmosphere gives us not so great air quality. And this also then, once it becomes precipitation, it's going to rain down, and it's really acidic rain. So if you've ever heard of acid rain, this is through this process of ammonia from extra fertilizers going into the atmosphere, ending up with water, raining back down. And because it's acidic, it can cause respiratory issues in humans and in animals. And it can also burn trees. There's areas in Europe where you can go and see actual burn marks on trees because of the acid rain that's hitting it. Now, what this also means is because it's going up into the atmosphere, it means that there's less nitrogen staying in the soil for the crops to use, which is not ideal for farmers because then they're losing money. They paid all this money for this fertilizer that's not even going towards their plants. It's just going towards acid rain. But another unfortunate process that we have is called leaching and eutrophication. And this is where you have synthetic fertilizers, which is causing nitrates here, to leach or be carried out of the soil by water. So you have runoff from rain, you have groundwater, it ends up taking that nitrate with it. And this runoff ends up in local waters, such as this diagram. You'll get this pretty little lake here, and the nitrogen is running off, and it's going to be leaching into that water source right there. And what nitrates can do is they cause algae blooms, because remember that algae are like plants. So they see nitrogen and they also thrive on it, just like the plants being fertilized do. And when they thrive on it, it causes a bloom that blocks out the sun, and it can kill the other aquatic plants that are living in the water there. So what you are going to practice today is you are going to describe one chemical transformation that occurs in the natural nitrogen cycle, and then explain the importance of that transformation to an ecosystem. And that's going to be your practice for the suggested skill of visual representations.